Hi. Okay, I've been promising a video on this topic for a while now, and let's just say a lot of takes have gone in the trash. As I've tried to figure out a way to present something meaningful, maybe something I could use in my videos going forward. And in my prior videos, my prior reviews on swords, I've hopefully given you some useful information. At least, going for information that's useful for me when I am looking at potentially purchasing a new sword. And that's everything from, the quality of manufacture, the reputation of the manufacturer, to the materials, to the stats. The overall length and versus the blade length and grip length, thickness, taper, overall weight, and yes, point of balance. Now, point of balance for me, I found, is often more of a deciding factor in how a sword feels than its weight. But those two certainly go together with some other factors that we're going to talk about today. But can I semi-scientifically quantify how a sword feels in my hand? Now, there is a weapons dynamics computer available for use online, and other YouTubers certainly have put it to use. And I've tried coming up with those statistics and parameters and things, the data that you need to plug in. And when all is said and done, I didn't feel like it was giving me useful information, especially for all the effort I put into it, which is where we need to talk about, Mike's inherent laziness, which is a subject that's going to come up probably several times in this discussion. But was there then maybe an easier way that I can come up with a useful and consistent data point that could give information about how a specific sword felt in my hands, how it handled? All right, I think I came up with something. So let's go up to the lab and see what's on the slab. All right, let's start where I did with what I call a tale of three swords. Three single-handed, straight-bladed, double-edged, cut and thrust swords that are all the same weight, 2 pounds, 12 ounces, but radically different in the way they handle. So starting with the Kingston Arms Dragon King Katzbalger. Now this has a slightly shorter blade at 25.5 inches compared to the other one, and yes, blade length will play into this a little bit. Point of balance on this one, though, because of all the metal in the handle and the thinness, the slimness of the blade, is sitting at 2 inches. And what it gives me is a sword that is extremely light and quick in the hand, but maybe too light in the way it feels for a cutting sword. We'll talk about that as we go forward. However, in the middle of the pack is the Ronin Type 12 arming sword, which some people have defined as kind of crowbarish in feel. Now, this one has a just short of 30-inch blade. Point of balance is at 4 inches. And yeah, this feels like it has a lot of presence in the blade, but it's not necessarily unbearable for me to move around. So good authority in the blade. It's a good cutter, but it's solid and definitely a workout. Okay, so point of balance went from 2 to 4. The Ronin Beowulf. Point of balance, 6 inches. Feels like a sledgehammer. It is so blade forward in weight that, yeah, even though I've been working with it for a while, it's still a heck of a struggle and puts some uncomfortable and potentially injurious strain on my old damaged joints. So that's something to consider. Now, that made me think, is there any way, other than struggling with that weapons dynamic computer, that I could kind of create something that would measure this phenomenon? And the thought I had was to take my scale and in different orientations rest the tip of the sword on the scale while I held it at basically what would be the top of my natural grip with the sword. Now, a couple of things came up as I was doing that. There wasn't a whole lot of variation if I was a little sloppy with the angle of the sword, a little bit. A couple of things that did make a difference. Obviously, we'll talk about where I was gripping the sword is a big one. But was I resting it on basically the true edge of the tip, what would be the yokote of a Japanese style sword? In certain situations, it made sense to rest it on the flat of the tip, or maybe, depending on the profile, the curvature of the blade, the back of the tip. And yes, curvature definitely made some difference in terms of how I measured this. Now, if it was a matter of inconsistent results across 2 or 3 of those, I would average them in ounces and came up with some interesting numbers. On the lower end, Kingston's tip weight in ounces, 5.5. You're going to find out that that's at the lower end of this number scale. .2. Okay. And I want you to remember a couple of numbers going forward. 8, 6, and then maybe 4. This will make sense later, I promise. Maybe. What about the Beowulf? 14.5. Okay, so a significant difference in those numbers. But let's talk about how some of my other swords did and what this potentially means. Because the more swords I did this to, eventually hitting my entire collection, I started getting some very, very consistent results. Consistent to the point that I could predict what the scale was going to say before I saw the number. So what did I get? All right, I asked you to remember 8, 6, and 4. I'm also going to have you remember 4 categories of weight class, of which we're mainly going to talk about 3. General weight ranges that I tend to separate my swords into, kind of like prize fighters. Now for me, heavyweight is about 3¼ pounds, give or take a couple of ounces, so about 1,500 grams. Anything heavier than 3½ pounds is probably going to be unwieldy for me, especially in one hand. It's just going to be way too hard on my old injured joints. So if I see a sword online that looks good and I see it weighs more than 3½ pounds, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to have to take a pass. And it's sad, but yeah, I know what I'm potentially buying. Now, point of balance is going to make a huge difference, and we'll talk about how that plays into it. But usually these are my heavier built, solid swords versus what I consider my middleweight class, which is about 2¾ pounds, so about 1,200 grams, again, give or take an ounce or so. Swords that have a nice balance of mass versus maneuverability, especially for using in one hand. Now, getting down into my lightweight class, about 2¼ pounds, so about 1 kilo, again, give or take an ounce or so. That's a sword that is usually pretty light in hand, but still has good mass authority for cutting. It's amazing how many of my Japanese style swords fall in this class. Below that, though, especially as I get below 2 pounds, I call that my featherweight class. So, about 800 grams or so. Don't have many in that category. Those would be like ultra weight, like my Kalish Mard, or like, if you remember the review I did on the Black Marauder rapier that my daughter marauded off with. Yeah, those would be in that class. Super light. Okay, what about that 8, 6, and 4? All right. When I was getting tip scores in that 8 range, give or take about ½ an ounce, that was usually a sword that felt like it had a lot of blade authority without being too extreme. I could still handle it. It wasn't going to overstress my joints, but it was probably going to come out being a solid cutter. Anything over a 9 was going to be uncomfortable, probably feel unwieldy and potentially injurious. So yeah, that 14.5 in the Beowulf is like way over the top of that. floating around a 6, give or take, is what I consider a sword that is a great balance between cutting and thrusting, very maneuverable, pretty quick, pretty handy. Getting below that into like 3, 4, these are swords that feel really, really light in the blade, and these are often my thrusters. So let's talk about a couple of different categories of swords. I'm certainly not going to get out every single sword in my collection to show you. I don't actually know how many swords are in. I have a list, but I haven't actually counted them. I think I'm probably afraid to. Anyway, let's talk about some general categories and some other factors that play into this equation. And you can see where I'm starting to get a sense of consistency where I feel like this might actually be useful. All right, let's talk about some interesting consistency, starting with, well, more arming swords. My arming sword collection runs in weight class from lightweight to medium weight, okay? However, I was consistently getting that 8 range in the tip score, somewhere between 7.5 and 8.5. So something, again, that has good authority in the blade, good blade mass, but not too unwieldy. What happens when you get longer and two-handed, though? All right, now I don't have a lot of long swords to draw from, but even in my limited sample, got some interesting information. Now, the 2 swords that are in the heavyweight class, that would be the Cold Steel Hand and a Half and the Ronin Italian, those were both pulling 11s. So in 2 hands, manageable, but still I could feel that weight, that inertia. They feel like iron bars. Whereas my Cold Steel Italian, which I've described as one of my favorite swords, and again we get into Mike's inherent laziness here, middleweight class, and yeah, that one is pulling a 7.5, which means it's wielding like an arming sword, at least in terms of feel. Now certainly the length makes it more awkward to use in one hand, but it doesn't feel bad in one hand, and in 2 hands it feels fantastic. This is going to come back when we talk about Japanese style swords. Hang in there for that. But let's talk about making those hilts more complex, which theoretically adds more metal around the hand, but also could potentially significantly change the way you grip the sword. Now, let's start with some where you don't necessarily grip the sword very different than a single-handed arming sword, and those would be my basket hilts. Yes, they're a bit restricted, but for me, not so much. Starting at the top end of it in the heavyweight class, my Cold Steel Scottish broadsword is running an 8.5. So yeah, it has that same, it's my heavier arming swords where I feel like I've got a lot of mass and authority in the blade, but not too much as to make it uncomfortable or potentially injurious. It's a good workout. However, my back swords, and we're talking the Cold Steel backsword, which is in the middleweight class, versus the Hanwei Cromwell, which is back in the heavyweight class. Yet they're both, because of that blade profile, pulling a 6. So something that feels a lot lighter and quicker and more maneuverable in hand. And for those of you who have handled the difference between a broadsword and a backsword, you might have noticed the same thing. Let me know in the comments. All right, let's get more complex, which gets us into fingering the guard. Starting with something like a side sword, okay? Often you're putting one finger above the crossguard, the quillin, and yeah, that does make a bit of a difference. We'll talk about it especially in terms of the rapiers, but 2 of my side swords in the heavyweight class, this Hanwei build that I'll probably do another video on soon since I've made some changes to it, and the Windlass Munich heavyweight class, and their tip scores are in the 8s. Okay, and that makes sense in terms of how they feel. Now, the Kingston Arms Renaissance side sword is in that medium weight class, and yeah, that one's running a 4.5. That one feels really, really, really like the Kotzbalger, really light in the blade, to the point where I don't train with it much because I feel like I'm kind of cheating. I'm not getting the workout I should. Still a good sword, but yeah, weight. I'm not necessarily feeling that authority in the blade. Great for thrusting, which gets us into, let's talk about rapiers. All right. Definitely designed to be much more thrust than cut-centric, so what are you getting out of them? Now, my Cavalier, cold steel Cavalier, that I've recommended to a lot of people is a great entry-level rapier, and I love it. It's in the middleweight class, and yeah, with one finger over the guard, it's pulling about a 5. So that's pretty nice. It's light, it's handy, but I still feel like I have good feel of the blade. Now going up to the heavyweight class in the windlass, talking my Musketeer and this one, the Christus Imperit. Heavyweight class, with one finger over the guard, they're pulling 6s. If I put 2 fingers over the guard, which on those two, the Cavalier has a short ricasso, you can really only fit 1 finger north of the guard. These I've been experimenting with 2 fingers north of the guard. That drops it down to both of them drops them down to a 4. So very light and quick and maneuverable in the blade. Speaking of which, what about that Kalish Mart? Yeah, as I said, it's in the lightweight class and it's pulling a 2.5. It is ultra light. And I'll remind you of that number a little bit later. But, all right. Another interesting thing, though, before we move on, and if you are a fan of, practitioner of, student of swords like this, you may have noticed this. Depending on the orientation of the blade, whether we're going from 2nd to 3rd to 4th or whatever, that also changed the numbers within a range of a good full point in either direction. And you might notice that, the different ways you hold these on guard. Some of them, they feel heavier and some lighter. And that came up in the test as well. All right. Let's talk about Japanese style swords. All right. I certainly have a much larger sample of Japanese style swords to draw from. And that gave me, well, even more consistent results, believe it or not. But let's talk about some samples, starting with what I'll call a tale of 2 swords. Now, these are 2 swords with similar dimensions and similar fixtures. And I mentioned fixtures because I've mentioned in previous videos that if you want to change the point of balance of a weapon like this that you can disassemble, the easiest thing that you can personally do is swap out the tsuba, right? These are very similar, but they do vary in one significant feature in their construction. We're talking about the Musashi Umi and the Musashi Umegami. And that feature is one has a bohei and the other one doesn't. How much does that change the overall weight? 7 ounces. The Umegami with the bohei, it's 2 pounds 3, so it's down right in the middle pretty much of that lightweight category. Whereas the Umi without is 2 pounds 9 and is therefore edging into the middleweight category. Now what about that tip score for feel? Well, the Umi with no bohei, that's a 9. Versus the Umegami, 7. Now remember that magic number 8. I've been using that as kind of my cutoff dividing line. Japanese style swords that run in that score, and they're all, again, mostly in the same weight category and often in the same length category. 8, 8.5 up to a 9. I tend to consider the 8.5s and the 9s to be my good heavy cutters, like my Musashi Bamboo. Versus the ones that are 8, 7.5 down to 7. Well, guess which ones Mike takes off the shelf more often to practice kata with? Yeah, there's my inherent laziness again. It's going to be the lighter feeling ones. Again, it's not so much about the total weight. It's definitely about the feel, which came up consistently in the scores. Those quicker, handier swords were usually 7.5 to 7, with an average feel of about an 8. Now, what about other ways you could take metal off a blade to make this end of it lighter? Well, there's an Unikubi Zukiri with the cut, and I will do another video on this because that cut actually doesn't take much more weight off than a good large bohei does. So that's an interesting thing. But what about if we go further and we go to the Kogarasu Maru, that double-edged profile where there's a lot more metal off? Okay, so the Unikubizukiri tends to run about a 7.5, depending on a number of factors. Kogarasu Marus, they tend to drop into 6.5. So yeah, a lot lighter and quicker, especially when you're talking about one-handed use. All right. Let's talk about some outliers in the pack. My original antique Shingunto Yoshi that I've trained with since 1980, I've described as being a heavy, beefy beast, a lot of niku, a lot of meat, is in the middleweight class at 2 3/4 pounds, tip score 9. So yeah, it's got massive authority in the blade, which also means I tend to struggle with it if I'm trying to use it one-handed. What about, I get a lot of questions about my Hanwei Practical series, and justifiably so, they're very popular. My original Practical and Practical Plus are lighter weight, and they're running in around 7. So they're light, quick blades, whereas my Practical Pro that I've described as almost being an okatana, not just for the overall length, but it's in the heavyweight class. Yeah, that's an 11. That is a big, heavy iron bar up there with some of my heavier long swords. One-handed, it's not happening. But a while back, I reviewed a Morisame Type 95, which had a solid copper hilt. That put that sword in the heavyweight class. But because of the shift in the point of balance, yeah, that sword's pulling a 6.5. Very light feeling in the blade, especially compared to the overall mass. Very quick sword. Speaking of which, recently I reviewed this APOC tactical katana. Now, 2 pounds 4 ounces, right in the middle of that lightweight class that most of my Japanese style swords fit in. But because of point of balance, this one's blade is scoring a 3, which means it's as light feeling in many ways as the Kalish Mard. Yeah. And it certainly does translate into how it feels and how it handles and how it moves. So, I think I found something meaningful for me and a lot simpler and quicker to use than the weapons dynamics computer. But let's get our conversation going. Is this meaningful information for you? Do you have any other method you use to calculate or describe how a weapon feels to you? Have you had more experience and success with the weapons dynamic computer? Maybe you can give me some tips. But, you know, I'm, again, as I mentioned, inherently lazy. And the fact that I have to admit that back when I had hair, at least according to my grades, I was good at math, but I lost certain things with age, and math was one of them. So something I can do really quickly and easily is certainly, as you've seen, appealing to me. But otherwise, until next time, thank you everyone for watching, liking the videos, following and subscribing. Again, thank you to everyone, because I just recently surpassed that magic threshold of 1,000 subscribers. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for being on this journey with me. And I hope to see you back for, well, wherever the semi-science takes me next.